I would walk the land and try to imagine what happened before. So I eventually looked up the history of this piece of property in the Hall of Records or whatever they call it in at the county offices, and found that this land was part of the checkerboard of squares that the U.S. government set aside for the railroad. So what they did was when they set that railroad line, which now is along Highway 80 from St. Louis, Missouri, the U.S. government kept checkerboard pieces of land for 20 miles to the north and the south of the proposed line. And so this is from one of the ones that the government took. And when they finally didn't use it in, I think it was 1879, they sold it to the first, to the first person who owned this land. Um, so I didn't really find much evidence. There's a little evidence of mining because there's a berm that they built. But even that is questionable. And then I found it was a pear orchard and like that. But I just started thinking about the land. And, and then also in thinking about the land, I thought about the rather shoddy education I got about the land as it was originally before it was settled. And what I was told was very just sketchy. There used to be people here, they were diggers, now they're gone, pretty much is what it was. And I knew that wasn't true, but then when we started having this noose conversation, which is within the last, well, actually it's been going on for 20 years, I discovered that the majority of people who were lynched in California were natives, Latinos, and Chinese. So that inspired me to look into my own family history and into the history of the native people in California. That's roughly how I got started on all this.
Yeah, it's a pretty scary history. Lots of bad things happened in not only this area, but actually all over California. Before non-Indians came, there are several different estimates from anthropologists that there could have been as many as from 30,000 native people up to 300,000 people in what's now known as California. So there were just people everywhere and been here for thousands of years. Very well established tribal communities with their own customs, their own dance, their own stories, their own foods. And because California is just ripe with everything, there wasn't a whole lot of war because the land provided them with everything. And so when Europeans started coming, the natives were not really very well equipped as far as, who are these guys, what do we do now? So there was a lot of conflict, and of course a lot of the Europeans have a mindset that ours is whatever we can take. And that's what happened a lot, including right here in El Dorado County.
Yeah. I also, as I was reading, I think I read something that said that California had the largest population of native people of any area in the country because food was so abundant. And then when I started looking at the different tribes, the groups were fairly small and scattered, one from another. There were like bands that would then come together. And I thought, well, that makes sense. If they're living off the land,
Mhm.
they don't want a huge population in one center.
Yeah.
And so they cooperated,
Mhm.
got together when they had common need to trade or
Yeah.
reasons to be together. But their daily life were pretty much small bands scattered.
Mhm.
And you can see how that would make them vulnerable.
Yeah. Well, they understood early on that you have an impact on the land when you grow too big or you stay in one place for too long. And so many of the tribes moved around a little, not great distances, but there were sometimes winter areas and summer areas, and so they would move around. And anytime it looked like they were starting to impact the environment, then they would just pack up their stuff. And they didn't have a lot of stuff, and most of the time would have winter homes and summer homes, so just like a lot of people do now.
Yeah.
They would just move, and it was their land. They knew the land. They knew where everything was that they needed. So it wasn't like, well, we have to move now. We got to go see if we can survive in another place. And a lot of times they left their stuff where it was, and rather than carrying, small bedrock mortars from place to place, they just left it there because they knew whatever they left the season before was still going to be there. They never had to worry about people stealing their things and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, as I started looking at the history, I saw the first Europeans to impact were the Spanish,
Mm-hmm.
and each group had its flavor, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The Spanish, have the mission system, which, in the process of saving souls, somehow they had servants. So basically, the native people were kept in bondage
Mm-hmm.
to work for the missions in sort of a relationship of servitude. Some call it slavery. And that was just part of the mission system.
Mm-hmm.
So all the labor, I'm from San Francisco, as you know, and I've been to Mission Dolores. And of course, the natives built that mission.
Mm-hmm.
San Francisco was one of the areas where they gathered native people together, and which gave the native people the opportunity to get smallpox and measles and diphtheria. So many of them died just from being gathered together in a small place from the disease that was passed around.
Yeah, they did. As you know, the mission system was throughout a large part of California, and so there were many tribes that were impacted. And I think if you asked people from those tribes, they would definitely say that it was slavery, because they were not really given a choice. And many of the missions, the men were kept separate from the women, even though families were there. The children usually stayed with the women, but the Spanish found different ways to make sure the native people cooperated in what they needed from them, which was basically labor. First of all, to build the missions, but then they also used native people for agriculture. They had, once the missions were established, they had to be able to feed themselves, so there was a lot of agriculture going on, and of course the native people did all of that for them. The Spaniards were basically the soldiers and the missionaries. If native people tried to run away, they would go after them and capture them, just like what happened in slavery. And then sometimes if they had run it several times, they might injure them in such a way that they couldn't run again. And sometimes they were just killed because they were a bother and they didn't want other Indian people getting ideas. I've been to a number of missions, and the buildings are beautiful, but the history is it's pretty horrible, and you can feel remnants of what was going on there. Every one of them has a cemetery associated with it, so a lot of people, Native people, died in that process. And sometimes you can go if you are real sensitive. You can feel some stuff still going on there. You know,
Yeah,
kind of spirit people still hanging around.
at Mission Dolores, definitely.
Yeah, yeah.
What?
I felt that before.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the practices they had that was continued is if they captured a runaway, they would punish them by lashing them.
Mm-hmm.
And just as was done with black slaves in the South.
Yeah.
So then Mexico had their revolution in the 1820s, and in 1830 they secularized the land. They took the land away from the church, and supposedly land was available to anyone who did the paperwork. They could get a piece of the land, including the Native people, was the idea, or was the stated situation.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened, of course, is that the wealthy landowners ended up with, or probably up to less wealthy,
Mm-hmm.
but Californios, Mexicans
Mm-hmm.
from California, ended up with the land. And all that land, all the Native people were displaced.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the tracts that were awarded to the people that you were just talking about were huge tracts of land, and land is money. You know, that's wealth.
So the Native people ended up being either pushed aside. Some of them went up the hills to join the folks in the foothills,
Mm-hmm.
because these lands were mostly coastal and valley.
Mm-hmm.
And others worked as cowboys. They worked on the ranches,
Mm-hmm.
but with the same kind of treatment.
Yeah.
If they would try to run away, they would be punished or killed. And then Sutter came in the 1835 or something, got a land grant from the Mexican government, and it seems like about that time started this business of running around kidnapping Native people to work on these ranches by both the early other European settlers, as well as the Mexican Californios that were already there. So they started these raids, capturing children for servants or men for workers. And that went on for decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sutter was not a very good guy. He basically started his own empire. He had built that fort that's now in downtown Sacramento. He even made trips to Hawaii and recruited a bunch of Hawaiian men to come back with him, and they basically became his army. And there's quite a few Native people that are members of the Shingle Springs Rancheria currently that have Hawaiian heritage as part of their background, and that Hawaiian heritage came from those people that came over with Sutter. So he had a big impact in a whole lot of ways, and if you look into his history, he's not a very nice guy.
even his guests, apparently he was very generous to his European guests that came to stay, but there are many reports from these guests of his ill treatment of his slaves.
Yeah.
I've got an article I can read to you from 1839 about
Okay.
Sutter. And also I have the law that Governor Bennett said about exterminating the natives. We should read that into it too, but we're kind of going chronologically right now. Okay, so here's an article from Theodor Cordua, who was a German immigrant who leased land from Sutter in 1839. So he says, when Sutter established himself in 1839 in the Sacramento Valley, new misfortune came upon these peaceful natives of the country. Their services were demanded immediately. Those who did not want to work were considered as enemies. With other tribes, the field was taken against the hostile Indian. Declaration of war was not made. The villages were attacked, usually before daybreak when everybody was still asleep. Neither old nor young was spared by the enemy, and often the Sacramento River was colored red by the blood of the innocent Indians, for these villages usually were situated at the banks of the rivers. During a campaign, one section of the attackers fell upon the village by way of land. All the Indians of the attacked village naturally fled to find protection on the other bank of the river, but there they were awaited by the other half of the enemy, and thus the unhappy people were shot and killed with rifles from both sides of the river. Seldom an Indian escaped such an attack, and those who were not murdered were captured. All children from 6 to 15 years of age were usually taken by the greedy white people. The village was burned down, and the few Indians who had escaped with their lives were left to their fate.
Yeah, there was a certain amount of money that was placed on the heads. Men were usually, you would get more money for a man's scalp, and women, you would get money for those as well. And there was a lot of, I think I remember one particular year, it was $200,000 or $300,000 was paid out for scalps, and basically just to clear the land, just like, you know, you're clearing trees to do something. You're clearing the population of native people to make way for those that are coming, and for if you're trying to lay a claim for gold mining or whatever, you know, you have to be able to show that there's nobody there and it's available, and that's how they did it. This occurred in a lot of places around the United States, all the way back to, you know, real early times, and the amounts were like $5 to $15 or something like that. And so I don't recall exactly what it was here in California at the time.
So here's government policy. On April 22nd, 1850, the fledgling California State Legislature passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, legalizing the kidnapping and forced servitude of Indians by white settlers. This law provided for apprenticing or indenturing Indian children to whites, and also punished vagrant Indians by hiring them out to the highest bidder at a public auction. If the Indian could not provide sufficient bond or bail, this legalized a form of slavery in California. White settlers took 24 to 27,000 California Native Americans as forced laborers, including 4 to 7,000 children. 27,000. The law was amended in 1860 and repealed in 1863.
I'm glad you read that. I know that lots of people are proud that California never participated in slavery, and that's just not true. And that's the perfect example of that. I know there were a lot of instances where families were separated and the children were taken into servitude, and sometimes the mothers and fathers were killed because they were in the way. And so, and there was also, I can't remember exactly how it described that, but if you were a native person that was just sitting somewhere relaxing or basket weaving or something, if a white person came by and thought you didn't have a purpose, that they could take you into servitude just with that much evidence, and that's what that whole law is about. I know lots of people from the area up around Chico, and lots of native people, and they have many, many stories of that happening. So we have a pretty sad history in California, even though a lot of people don't know about it.
Right. Here's another article. In 1851, the civilian governor of California, that his name was Bennett, declared that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct. Must be expected. This expectation soon found its way into law. An 1851 legislative measure not only gave settlers the right to organize lynch mobs to kill Indians, but allowed them to submit their expense to the government. By 1852, the state had authorized over $1 million in such claims.
Part of where the term digger came from. Native people see that as a real derogatory word, and kind of how black people would see the N-word, but it was used by early people, and the gold miners used it exclusively to describe native people, and there were many different tribes, but they weren't really looked at as tribes. They were just all diggers that were in the way. But and even the term digger started making its way into government reports to Washington of what stuff is going on, and people who worked for the government, and their job was to make reports on what was happening in the area, used the term digger also. And it took a long time for people to discover that was a bad word. Native people really didn't appreciate that, and there were people in Washington that kind of put a policy together to do away with the word digger in all government documents, and it took a long time for that to happen. Actually, in Ione, I think this was in the early 1900s. I can't remember the exact date, but a big group of Miwok people got together, and they had a ceremony, and there are some photographs of it, and they call it the burning of the digger effigy. And that there's a photograph with lots of native people, and they built an effigy and they burned it as a way to get rid of the word digger. But even today, there's people that talk about diggers, and there's a tree, a pine tree, and there's one right there.
Over there.
And it's commonly known as a digger pine because the local people used the pine cones and the pine nuts from it a lot. And so I hear a lot of times, just in conversations with non-Indians, they'll say all the digger pine and that, and I usually will well, not usually, I always will stop for a moment and tell them what that's about. And most of the time they're pretty, they feel badly that they've been doing that and using that term. So, the native people use lots of plants and dug the roots for foods and for medicines and all those kinds of things. So, and they use digging sticks, like you said. They're sharpened sticks, and that allowed them to gather what they needed without making a big disturbance, and so the plants could continue to live. So their process was always with taking what they needed, but also making sure that they left the plants in good shape so that they would continue to survive and give them what they needed. So I know in the gold rush days that was real common, and it's just, the term just spread really quickly. But yeah, that's where the term came from.
Pretty ironic, since the gold miners were the ones digging
Yeah,
in the dirt.
yeah, I've thought of that many times.
The other part of it is, you know, so far I haven't found any family members that were killing people, but I mean, on both sides of my family, on my father's side, they got land from the Homestead Act in 1854, and they had a farm, 40 acres, you know. Where did that land come from? And then the Hesselgessers became prosperous, you know. What do you know? And my mother's side is from California, from Europe to California. They also bought land. He bought land, the German guy that came from Germany. Grew produce, sold it to the miners. So he was just a farmer, selling produce to the miners, growing food. That's a kindly occupation. But the natives that were there, of course, you know, we don't think about how that land was procured and the impact of that procurement. So we feel, well, none of my ancestors killed anybody, not directly. I mean, that's the thing, that's the tricky part of it, you know. We stand on the shoulders of those people.
But you found that the hill up here was called N
Oh,
Hill.
well, I was looking at just Placerville history at the museum on Placerville Drive, the History Museum, and you know, just as there's China Hill, there's Chili Bar, at the top of where Highland comes into Mosquito, that was called Nigger Hill because it was settled by a group of blacks from the South, I forget what state, but it was a church group, some Baptists that settled there, and they grew grapes and produce and sold them to the miners. So, I don't know, you know, that's all, obviously they're not here now. Yeah, there were a lot of people that came around here, as my ancestors did up in Redding, selling food to the miners. That was a way to make money.
So how far forward does your history go?
Well, the extermination part goes to the end of till actually it's like 1870s.
And both of you guys referenced the Mountain Democrat, and James made mention of the headline, but I mean the Mountain Democrat was documenting this stuff.
I can read this. Do you have something?
I didn't bring it. I couldn't find it actually.
Okay. Well, this is, I'll just excerpt a little bit from this article. Sarah Darlington. Darlington is one of the big local names. We have Darlington Meadow and Darlington Hill and so on. wrote this article for the Democrat in 1890, and she was comparing she says, mix up a number of uneducated native Hawaiians and an equal number of our own Nishinani or Digger Indians of both sexes, and she compares the two groups. And I just highlighted, she didn't say anything about the Hawaiians except comparing them to the Diggers. So this is how she saw the Nisenan at that time. Easy, peaceable, laughter-loving temperament, gentle friendliness and ready sympathy. She says the Nishinans are the superior to the Hawaiians because they're more moral, less superstitious, their religion was more refined, their belief was in a great unknowable spirit and a happy existence after death. Look at the nations now. It will take a greater anthropologist than I to tell why the dark races wither and die before the march of the white man. And those that remain are in degraded conditions, are poor wards. But there's nothing to do about it, she says. But what the white man could do, he has already done to elevate them. He has built schools where their children may receive not only what we here term a fair common school education, but the boys are taught useful arts, and the girls cooking, sewing, and housewifery in general. So, they were nice people, they're gone, what to do. And then she says those that are left, the handful of forlorn little creatures that California has given over to be consumed by vice and vermin, having robbed them of their country and their honest living, and given them nothing in return but whiskey and degradation. A once free, independent, self-respecting people, downtrodden, reviled, clad in our cast-off rags, eating scrap of victuals thrown to them as alms by us, who have robbed them of their country and their birthright, their forests of game, their rivers of fish. It is too late now. Soon will the kindly soil close over the last of a ruined race.